I get the feeling that most people have at least a few things that were before their time that they wish they could have experienced. For me, one of those things is the arcade era of video games, specifically during the 90s. There's something in particular about this period that feels like the perfect storm of creativity and technological innovation. There's so many interesting and unique games from that time that seem to be nearly forgotten today. It doesn't help that access to many titles is so limited. Older games that are made available are often lazily ported and offer relatively bare-bones experiences. Even when games are made more widely available, like on the Wii Shop channel, they still tend to get delisted over time. Game preservation is definitely an uphill battle, but at least the games themselves are able to be stored and played again. What can't be preserved and fully replicated, at least not in any tangible way, is the experience of living in the era that these games were released. Arcades, on the whole, are dying out. Even in Japan, one of the last places with a prominent arcade presence, they've been slowly disappearing for a long time, and the process has only accelerated because of COVID-19. Once consoles started to match the power of arcade boards and ports started to become arcade perfect, it makes sense that they would gradually become obsolete. In many aspects, I don't even think I would particularly enjoy the arcade experience. Having to pay for every play, interacting with others to learn about games, and having to actually leave home to go to the arcade are major inconveniences that I don't particularly want to deal with. But even so, there's something almost romantic about the idea of the arcade as a centerpiece of gaming culture. Even if you're lucky enough to have an arcade around that actually has retro games, playing them just won't be the same experience as actually being there when those games were new and cutting edge. No matter how much you try, there's really no way to replicate the exact combination of being in the right time and place to experience 90s arcade culture at its fullest. But at least we have High Score Girl. High Score Girl is a coming-of-age romance story, and while anime is full of quality shows from that specific genre, it earns this place as a particularly special entry. It follows Haruo Yaguchi from the years 1991 to 1996, as he goes from elementary to high school, and uses his experience as an obsessive gamer to create a window into the feeling of living in and enjoying video games within those years. I've seen a decent amount of informational content surrounding this era of games, but most of them have a focus on game development or recalled stories. High Score Girl, in contrast, is a very meticulous reproduction of the culture, attitudes, and experiences of arcade goers in Japan from the early to mid-90s. The show and manga are absolutely packed to the brim with obscure games, interesting trivia, and unique quirks of the time. A large portion of the story is centered around fighting games, and uses the genre's progression over time to show the evolution of the medium as a whole. The series heavily focuses on Street Fighter II, and really shows how much the mentality surrounding fighting games has changed in the 30 years since its initial release. I've heard stories about how throws used to be cheap, or how zoning was considered lame and dishonorable, but it's an entirely different feeling watching a show where characters actually end up in fights for using these strategies. It also shows the progression of the meta surrounding these games over the time that the series takes place, as knowledge increased, attitudes changed, and new techniques emerged. The detail with which it evokes the little quirks of the era is impressive, and always at the forefront of the show. At one point, one of the characters flicks the arcade stick to pull off 360 motion attacks, which is a real technique known as the Hijiki screw. There's a manga-only chapter where the characters try to discover the inputs for hidden moves in Darkstalkers by looking through arcade notebooks, communal booklets where players would write secrets that they discovered. Even little details that the average person wouldn't know, like the incredibly slow load times for SNK's Neo Geo console, are turned into gags. The focus on embodying the time is impressive, and a unique draw to the series, but it's not the only one that High Score Girl has. It's supplemented by a pretty quality story. As an anime love triangle, it comes with all of the typically associated melodrama, but with its strong character writing, it manages to not feel overdone and earns its emotional moments. As the protagonist, Haruo does kind of fit the category of the typical dense main character, but instead of being infuriating, which is normally expected of the archetype, he instead comes off as pretty relatable. For one, the girls in the show aren't throwing themselves at him constantly, which makes his obliviousness more tolerable than in some other shows. On top of this, his general inferiority complex and drive to improve himself as he matures over the course of the series is endearing. The two female leads are also great characters in their own right. Akira Ono is the deuteragonist of the series, and is mostly defined by her ability to do well at anything she tries, including video games. She doesn't speak a word throughout the entire show, but impressively, her progression and attitude are effectively communicated through her expressions and actions. I wouldn't say she has the most engaging character arc though, particularly since she is essentially a goal for Haruo to reach for. Her social status, gaming skills, grades, and pretty much everything else are all leagues above Haruo's, which pushes him to improve in different ways throughout the series. So while she does have challenges to face and develops throughout the show, Ono is more often the driving force for other characters than the one taking action herself. Koharu Hidaka, on the other hand, is the opposite. In the same way that Haruo is driven to change by Ono, Hidaka is driven to change by Haruo. When she's introduced early on in the series, she's mostly uninterested in games, but gets pulled in by his earnest love for the medium. Her progression from general apathy to being increasingly drawn into the depths of arcade culture mirrors her change from withdrawn and unassuming to being more outgoing and strong-spirited. And while she's bound to have a rough time, considering she's not the girl on the cover, she's my favorite of the main characters and her arc is really satisfying to watch. The main trio aren't alone though. They're surrounded by a colorful group of supporting characters. Their classmates, teachers, families, and other acquaintances also help give the series this unique sense of identity and humor. Only a few of them actually play a significant role, but even the ones that don't are fun to watch in the scenes that they're in. Haruo's mom and Ono's older sister in particular bring a lot of energy whenever they show up, and the scenes when they both appear are even more dynamic than when they're apart. Other than a few episodes of Kill Me Baby, I haven't seen any of director Yoshiki Yamakawa's other works, but despite his apparent lack of experience with full 3D, he shows a pretty good use of the freedom it allows for camera movements. It's not overdone, but occasional sweeping and moving shots are used to add to certain scenes. Unfortunately, this doesn't help the major flaw of the series and a consistent problem with 3D shows in general. It's just not that good looking. There are so many aspects where it drops the ball visually. The movements can be stiff and lifeless, the lines and shadows that are generated can be strangely placed and feel like they lack the intent of hand-drawn art, and the character models can sometimes feel like they aren't adjusted in a way that fits the 3D medium. One specific example of the awkwardness that can occur is in the relatively frequent close-up shots. The thick, vectory lines that are used for the facial features often look weird, especially at certain distances where the other lines of the face are really thin in contrast. And since the lines aren't redrawn for every position, like they would be in hand-drawn animation, when the angle they're rendered at is too large, they can start to look warped. I'm being a little nitpicky here, but overall I think that the variety of issues with the visuals really adds up and just makes them feel subpar overall. I wouldn't say it's hideous or anything, but it could definitely look better. There is the alternative of reading the manga though. As a result of being adapted to the anime format, most series go through somewhat of a generification, where some of the intricacies of the style are ironed out and a more versatile, reproducible look is used. High Score Girl definitely has some of this. Rensuke Oshikiri's art isn't particularly technically proficient. There's a lot of off-looking anatomy and strange proportions, but it definitely is unique and has a distinct character. It shines most in its stylized moments where it's less reliant on the fundamentals of Oshikiri's art ability and allows for the creativity of the imagery to shine through. The anime adaptation loses a lot of the character in exchange for higher consistency, but with the other issues it has in presentation, I can't really say that it's a better experience based on the visuals alone. What's invaluable to the story and presentation of High Score Girl though, is the use of genuine game footage and sprites throughout the show. The manga and anime are both full of scenes with gameplay and use characters for a lot of visual metaphors, but in the manga all of this is a drawn replication of the actual game visuals. For a series that's entirely focused around games and evoking this particular era, the use of real game footage is pretty important to the atmosphere, and on its own makes the show a superior experience. The advantage of having game visuals isn't the only reason to watch the anime though. Not just for High Score Girl, but in general, the addition of audio is one of the biggest game changers for adaptations. As if there needed to be more proof that this show is an absolute labor of love, the score is done by Yoko Shimomura, one of the most beloved and celebrated game composers of all time. Her body of work is legendary, and as one of the co-composers for the original soundtrack of Street Fighter II, The World Warrior, it's fitting for her to provide the music for a series so heavily focused around it. But while this is definitely an exciting collaboration, I can't say that I think this is her best work. Possibly because of her relatively small amount of experience with anime and the general mismatch of the romantic comedy genre to the styles of music in the games that she's worked on. Most of the music doesn't particularly stand out. This is also partially since the way that the music is used isn't all that strong in the majority of the series. There are a few tracks that are memorable though. Haruo mains Guile in Street Fighter II, and in his moments of determination throughout the show, a theme very similar to Guile's plays, which really elevates the scenes when it appears. The theme songs for the show are incredibly good though. Soratob Sakana does both of the openings, which are a really interesting mix of dizzying guitar riffs, chiptune melodies, and J-pop vocals. It reminds me a lot of the recent wave of math and progressive rock, and makes the beginning of every episode a treat. The ending themes are both done by Etsuko Yakushimaru, and while they may not be absolute bangers like her opening from Owadu Penguin Drum, they're also enjoyable and are used pretty well for closing out episodes. But while I think the music overall isn't the most effective, the voice acting is actually pretty great. Kohei Yamasaki stars as Haruo and is quite good at delivering the obsessive energy required to convey his love for games. Haruo can go long periods while talking a lot, to the point where it can get slightly annoying sometimes. But despite that, Amasaki manages to pull off a good performance. Sayumi Suzushiro does a good job giving Ono personality despite her silence, and Yuki Hirose brings Hidaka to life by evoking her change in expressiveness over time and really nailing her emotional scenes. But honestly, I think the biggest win from the voice acting is actually the side characters. Since a lot of them don't have much room to be fully fleshed out, they can be a little one note, but Oshikiri has a talent for writing characters with quirks and personalities that stand out regardless of screen time. And with the addition of expressive voices, these characters get the chance to shine even more than before. Again, Haruo's mom and Ono's older sister stand out in this category. I especially enjoyed Satomi Arai's performance, and it's made me pretty interested in watching other series she's in just to see how she does in different roles. With the benefit of the voice acting on top of the other advantages of the show, I can't say I really recommend the original work unless you have a very strong preference for manga over anime. But while I do think the show is a better overall experience than the manga, there are a few benefits that the original work has over the anime. Despite being a complete adaptation of the source material, the show does skip some of the content in the original and also condenses a few parts of the manga. There's some bonus content that just isn't in the anime, like the chapter I previously mentioned where Haruo and Ono seek out hidden Darkstalkers moves, and a chapter where Hidaka starts going to arcades and learns how to enjoy them despite how incredibly male-targeted the games are. Nothing that's missing is essential to the main plot, but these side stories are more interesting looks into the little details of the time. With all of its aspects combined, High Score Girl is a really unique experience. Even with so many other shows out there, including ones that actually aired in the 90s, I can't think of one I've seen that so specifically tries to evoke and share the feeling of this era of games. And for those that enjoyed the original, there's a sequel manga in the process of being published right now. Titled High Score Girl Dash, probably a reference to the second version of Street Fighter II, it stars Hidaka and takes place around a decade after the end of the first series. With more of a focus on the decline of the popularity of arcades, it seems like it'll be an interesting new story that will give Hidaka more of a spotlight than before, which makes me curious to see where the series goes. But, regardless of its future direction, I think that High Score Girl is something that anyone with an interest in fighting games, arcade games, or retro games in general should see. It's absolutely overflowing with passion, and more than anything, makes me hope that I'll be able to experience going to a retro arcade with an actual community before they disappear altogether.